None of this will now be decided on costs. I mean, the reality is that just the Premier League's cost on the Everton case alone was over £4.9 million. The chances are that both sides have spent in excess of £10 million. By the time it's finished, possibly in excess of £20 million each.
They're not customers, they're fans, and that is a really important piece to remember.
That is what a seat costs now to watch Premier events, including Premier League football and Champions League football.
Dynamic pricing means that if there's still tickets left, the price should go down as well. So as long as it's fair.
A club like that came in and said, Stefan, we want you to be our CEO. Would you do it?
I'm available. I'm ready.
Hello and welcome to How Football Works, a new talkSPORT YouTube show breaking down the ins and outs of the business side of the beautiful game. I'm Olly Clink, thanks for your company. I'm joined today by the former financial advisor for Manchester City and football finance expert Stefan Borson and the former Millwall CEO Steve Kavanagh. Welcome to you both. Let's kick off with the story that we can't ignore at the moment, Leicester City and PSR. To put it very simply, if I can, the Foxes were charged with breaching the rules when they were in the Premier League back in 22-23, but because they were relegated, they were able to argue that they weren't a Premier League club at the time, and so the rules didn't apply. Now, Stefan, there's obviously much more nuance to this, but firstly, what were your thoughts on this judgment?
Well, look, it's surprising to the extent that it appears, as we sit here now, that they are outside of the jurisdiction of either the EFL or the Premier League, which instinctively doesn't feel right, which is why we have the reactions that we've had from both the Premier League and the EFL themselves. But I think we should remember that the appeal panel, the appeal board that heard that case was a very high quality legal panel. You had a KC and then you also had two former Courts of Appeal judges. So the idea that they came to their judgment on some sort of error or mistaken understanding of what were effectively quite simple arguments, I think is wrong. And I think the Premier League's reaction was a little disrespectful, actually, in respect of who'd made that decision and the quality of the appeal board.
Steve, just to come to you on this, because of course we know about the reaction of the Premier League. They've said that they were very disappointed about all this. But I want to ask you about the clubs in the EFL. You're a former CEO of one too. I mean, how disappointed will they be with this judgment, given that Leicester came down and then stormed straight back up, despite the fact they had these charges hanging over them?
I think it's inevitable that clubs are going to be disappointed. And don't forget, this isn't the first time that the EFL tried to capture them within their rules as well. So, yes, clubs will be disappointed, but this isn't the first time. And I think the EFL over the last few years have learned that the rules have been in existence for a long time, and the rule book's been developed and evolved over time. The world's got more sophisticated. Football's become a much higher profile in certainly financially, and the rules are catching up. I think the EFL has done a good job from the lessons they learned over the years, such as clubs selling stadia to allow them to comply, and the frustrations the clubs have with that. So I think the rules have been the rules, and as Stefan says, KCs and others have looked at these. I think all you need to do is to move on and quickly close these loopholes and make sure the rules going forward are fit for purpose. And all you can do is try and ensure that you've looked forward and close as many of the doors as possible. But the legal profession are very good at finding those loopholes and probably earning quite a lot of money out of it.
Is the easy fix for this, Stefan, that it comes under one jurisdiction? Because as you said there, Leicester seem to find themselves in this no man's land between the EFL and the Premier League. Would that be the way that you go about fixing this?
Personally, I would fix it with some changes to the rules. I mean, I think the Premier League could have made some fairly simple changes to the definition of a club, which was the biggest issue that the Premier League had in their rules. A club, as defined in the Premier League rules, does not include a team that had been relegated, which, when we look at it in retrospect, seems crazy. The EFL also has a kind of catch-all rule at the end that effectively says if you are promoted or relegated out of the EFL, you are still obligated to fulfil the rules until you have complied with all of our rules. So it captures you even beyond the relegation and the promotion, whilst you still have obligations to that league. And the Premier League could have done that. I think to have a body that is trying to govern very complex financial rules in particular in respect of 92 clubs, I think is going to be a remit that's just too big. And it would just give, you would end up having to spend an enormous amount of money to resource an organisation like that. So in itself, I think that the leagues should be capable of regulating their own clubs, but clearly simple loopholes need to be closed. And I think they will be closed quite quickly by the Premier League in particular in respect of the Leicester situation.
So Leicester have survived this time around, but this might not be the end of the road for it, because there are reports that they also have had a few issues with the 23-24 season. So could there be some punishments in the future for Leicester because of that? Yeah,
so if you were to read the various decisions that we've had in respect of Leicester throughout the season, because they had a challenge with the EFL in respect of the business plan that they needed to provide to them or refused to provide to them. Within that decision, both the EFL and also Leicester themselves highlighted that they were likely to fail based on the forecast provided for 23-24 PSR. So as we sit here now, it is likely that they're close. They ended up selling in the year Harvey Barnes to Newcastle at the start of the year. We also know that they sold Kieran Dewsbury Hall right at the end of the period. And we also know they got the Maresca compensation. So they did have probably something like 70 to 90 million pounds of player trading type profits. That may have fixed their deficit for this year. But clearly, when you're relegated, you have a very big hit on the broadcast revenue, at least. So they may have been okay in terms of their match day revenue because they had more fixtures. So broadly, they would have been in line with the prior season. But broadcast, they will have taken a very substantial hit. And then it's a question of what they did commercially. So I think it's going to be borderline for 23-24. If they have failed PSR for 23-24, we know that that will be assessed under the expedited rules that are now in place in the way that it was with Nottingham Forest. And they can expect that to be heard in the second half of the season, and any appeal to be carried out before the end of the season, and any points deduction that flows from that to be in this season that we're now in.
And, and that's the kind of punishment we're looking at, would be a points deduction?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, so we know that their breach of 22-23 was going to be £20 million, £19.4 million by the time the Premier League had revised its numbers. That probably would have been, before mitigation, maybe 6 points. So, you know, I think the range that you're looking at is starting at 3 points deduction, and then going up from there depending on the scale of the breach. And then you have to look at the aggravating factors and the mitigating factors, as we did with the other cases, Nottingham Forest and Everton. Clearly, cooperation is the big mitigation that clubs can get. So the earlier you admit it and the more cooperation you give to the process, the more likely you are to get 1, 2, 3 points back of the penalty. But we'll just have to see. Obviously, all of these cases are based on the facts of the individual case. But we do now have, from the Everton cases and from the Nottingham Forest cases, we do now have a feel for the sort of range of points penalties that are coming for breaches of PSR.
Steve, just before we move on, PSR and its current form, there are prospective changes on the way, but do you believe at the moment it is fit for purpose?
The rules were put in place by the clubs, and I think within reason it is fit for purpose, but people have clearly looked at how to game the system, play the system and work the system. That's not what the intention of clubs and putting the rules in place was for. So they're fit for purpose as far as clubs want to engage with them and operate under them. When you get the scenarios that the EFL had go back over the years and as now you're seeing, then those rules are tested to the extent that they're found to be short. But it's only by testing them and progressing them. What slightly concerns me is we inevitably are going to move to a new form of regulation and looking at percentage of turnover and salary cost management, whatever you want to describe it as. And what worries me is you then start with another set of rules and people will test those rules. So rules are only as good as the people that are operating under them, their desire to work within them.
Well, we'll see how that one rumbles on. But Leicester aren't the only club who have been involved in courtroom battles. There is, of course, the ongoing case with Manchester City, who face a reported 115 charges from the Premier League for various financial misdemeanours. A story broke this week, though, suggesting that the Premier League could be hit with a legal bill of tens of millions for their case with City, even if they win it. Now, Stefan, you are a man of many talents. You're not just a football finance expert, you're a lawyer as well. Firstly, could you just explain why that would be the case?
So typically, what we know is that the costs regime that will flow from this case will effectively follow the normal rules in English law. And it will be akin to a High Court commercial case. And we know that because there is a decision around costs in respect of the Everton case, where we get quite a lot of detail about how the Independent Commission and the Appeal Board look at the costs of these cases. And what they tell you in terms of English law High Court commercial cases are that effectively loser pays. But what that doesn't mean is that you get 100% of your costs back from the other side. It'll typically be a range of between 70 and 90%, depending on whether the losing party gets an award against them for indemnity costs, as it's known. So typically for very serious matters, such as fraud or other misdemeanours of that nature, where the party tries to defend itself and loses, then it's quite possible that the other side would get indemnity costs. So in that scenario, you can expect the winning side to get 85 to 90% of their costs back. But it's very rarely going to be 100% of the costs. And clearly that means, in this case, you may well have a situation where even if the Premier League win on everything, even then, they don't get 100% back, and that could be a few £1 million of costs that they have. Now, in the worst case scenario for the Premier League, where, let's say, the Independent Commission finds against City, let's say, only in respect of non-cooperation, one of the more minor matters, in that scenario, you would probably expect the Premier League to be able to get quite a low level of its costs back. And it's possible in that scenario that actually City could get some of their costs back, because effectively City would have won that part of the case. So the Independent Commission would want to come up with an agreement between the parties that allows a fair allocation of the cost for effectively wasted court time. So if you've made a case and failed with it, then you can expect to pay most of the costs of the other side.
Talking of costs, what are you hearing about the amount of money that Manchester City are spending on their legal teams? We know they're going to be the biggest and the best, but what's the figure looking like?
I think it's impossible to predict what the number might be, and that applies to both sides. But we know that it's going to be, in all likelihood, tens of millions of pounds, because just the Premier League's cost on the Everton case alone was over £4.9 million. And the Everton case compared to the City case is a very simple case. So the chances are that both sides have spent in excess of £10 million and possibly, by the time it's finished, possibly in excess of £20 million each. So very, very significant costs here on both sides. It won't just be a case of City spending a fortune. It will absolutely be the Premier League also spending a fortune, because they both got the very best that money can buy in terms of English legal expertise on their side.
Could the Premier League back down in this instance, do you think? Do you think that at some point they might even be outpriced by what Manchester City are doing? I mean, there are reports that Lord Panic, for example, is earning something like £5,000 an hour to work on this case. Is there any feasibility for that kind of scenario?
No, it won't be. None of this will now be decided on costs. I mean, the reality is that we sit here sort of on the eve of whenever it kicks off. We know it's soon, we don't know when. But by this stage, the parties have really already sunk the vast majority of the fees that they're going to spend on the case. So I wouldn't think that at this stage fees would be the key driver. They may come into the mix, but they won't be the key determinant of the strategy going forward. And it's starting to feel quite late for the parties to come up with a settlement between themselves on the other matters as well. So at the moment, it does look like it is going to go to the hearing. And we are, at some point next year, probably going to see 200 to 400 pages of decision that sets out exactly why the Independent Commission has decided as it's decided. I don't think it's now likely to settle at this stage.
Steve, what's the general feeling been for this, not just for clubs in the Premier League, but across the board as well? Because you feel that any judgment in this case is going to have such a seismic impact on English football.
Yeah, look, I think the rules are the rules. And as I said earlier, the rules are put in place by the clubs. So the rules have to be defended and worked and improved because they are there because the clubs want them there. I think I'm right in saying, and certainly under the EFL, the costs of the Premier League are the costs of all the other clubs in the Premier League, of course. So everyone's paying for this, not the Premier League. Let's remember that. And therefore, they are vested interests. They have to have a vested interest because if the rules don't stand, where do clubs stand? Why have rules? There's no offside then. You've got to have these rules within the game to give some structure and framework to what is happening.
In that sense, then, if the Premier League were to lose this case to Manchester City, how much of an impact do you think that would have across the board in terms of the trust?
Look, they've lost the case on a technicality with Leicester, and the EFL over the years, and they've run more cases in the Premier League, have lost various aspects of different cases. What they've then done is gone to the clubs, and let's remember it's the clubs that put the rules in place. The clubs vote on those rules. They go to the clubs and say, do you want this rule? So they then enhance it's all about what the clubs want. And that's the really important factor in this. So losing it isn't a death knell for football, the football rules. It's about what comes next and what do the clubs want next.
I want to ask you about the amount of charges, because 115 is the number that we keep hearing. It's the one in the headlines. But is there any sense that there could be more than that?
No, and well, look, the actual number is 129. if you were to look at each individual rule breach, it's a bit of a misnomer anyway, because a lot of those charges are effectively the same charge duplicated over multiple years. So I wouldn't really focus too much on the headline number. It gives a nice headline. It does give a sense of the scale of the case. So it's positive in terms of framing it like that. But in reality, there are only a small number of sort of topics that this is going to cover. You've got the sponsorship, you've got the manager's remuneration, you've got player remuneration, and then you've got non-cooperation. And then there are various things that would be subsequent failings if some of those things are proved. So if sponsorship misdemeanours are proved, then of course it does mean that City's numbers are wrong in terms of what's been filed with the Premier League. So you would have the consequential failure of that particular point, and therefore a rule breach. So I wouldn't fixate too much on the rule, on the number itself. It's much more about, for me, it's much more about the seriousness of the allegations. And there's no question these are very serious allegations against City and against the third parties that are also alleged to have been involved in the misdemeanours that are set out within the claim that's been made. And clearly all we know is the charge sheet. There's no public detail about each individual breach and what the Premier League are alleging. So we've had to piece it together. But we are sure that these are very serious allegations. And therefore, that's why we're going to see a very long hearing. And we're going to see them really evaluated in a very serious manner by this three-person panel.
Speaking of public detail, it's reported this case, the hearing to start next Monday, the 16th of September. Will people be able to watch this? Will we be able to get some details from this? How will that all play out?
Yeah, I mean, look, we haven't even got confirmation that it does start on Monday. I've felt for a long time that it would have been in everybody's interest for it to at least have been publicly announced as to when it was being heard, just so that people could get a feel for how long it was taking, when it was kicking off, and what was actually happening in the background. But it will not be held in public, so it is specifically within the Premier League rules. It has to be private and confidential. So the likelihood is that we'll get no information whatsoever. And I would really caution people to be quite careful about any rumours that they do hear about what's going on in there. Because the reality as well is that both parties, when you have a 3-person panel deciding on it, even parties that are listening and that are both up against each other within the hearing, even they won't really know exactly which way it's going. They'll have a feel for whether certain points have landed with the panel or maybe with an individual on the panel, but they won't have that great a feel for how it's going. So I would just be cautious about really believing anything that you hear rumour-wise about how things are going. And in terms of the fine detail, we'll get absolutely nothing. Sadly, that just is the way that private arbitration of this nature works.
When do you think we'll hear a verdict for this then?
I think it'll take quite some time. If it's true that this really is a 10, 12-week hearing, in a civil law context, that's quite a long hearing. That means that the panel is going to hear a lot of information, a lot of witness evidence, a lot of expert evidence, and a lot of submission from barristers. And I think it will then take quite some time for this 3-person panel then to write up its decision. And it does have to write it up. So Richard Masters confirmed when the Premier League launched a couple of weeks ago that we would get a written set of reasons for the decision that's made. And that's correct. And I would expect that to be, it could be 200 to 400 pages long. It will be incredibly detailed. But you would imagine that that kind of detail and that kind of analysis and sort of focus from the panel is going to take some time for them to put together because they will all be going on to their own other roles and other arbitrations and other hearings that they're also working on. So they're going to have to find time between themselves to write up those reasons. And it's going to take quite a while. In a High Court perspective, if this was a High Court hearing, it would take months. I mean, it would take, possibly as long as a year before we were to get a decision from this hearing. I would expect it not to be a year, but I would expect it to be a number of months.
Steve, given that so far we've talked about a lot of clubs that have been in a bit of bother off the field, what would your thoughts be on an independent regulator in football?
So look, I was on the EFL board for the last 2 years. The EFL strongly backed the call for an independent regulator, if only because actually trying to find solutions between the Premier League and the EFL financially, the EFL, they just don't have any chips at the casino. They're really in a difficult place. What you've got to be careful with an independent regulator is how much involvement they have, where their involvement is. And I think, as I attended an event yesterday at the House of Lords around the regulator, and Nick DeMarco, who sat on the Leicester cases, the KC, spoke there. And what was clear across all the panel is there are so many different areas of interest that people feel a regulator could or couldn't get involved in. It can become an incredibly complex area for a regulator to come and look at, because football now is not just about 11v11 on a pitch. It is a massive industry and has significant consequences way beyond the pitch. You talk about the written reasons. To me, one of the reasons they'll take so long to get those written reasons done is because they will know what's coming, and that's an appeal. So football is complex, and a regulator is going to have a difficult task. And I think we need to be careful what that task is, what they're doing, and we also need to make sure that they have input from football people, because from the outside things can look easy, but when you understand the complexities underneath, they get a bit trickier.
With a regulator, that you wouldn't want too much involvement. What for you is too much involvement?
But I think their scope and their direction and what they are doing have to be carefully set out so you don't get scope creep. If they start creeping into all sorts of different areas and start becoming the FA, then what's the point of the FA? Now, there is a strong argument that the FA could and maybe should have been the regulator, but we're way beyond that moment. So It's just making sure that they're there to protect the sustainability of the game, to protect clubs that are community assets, and to ensure that there is a fair distribution down the game so that these community assets are not put at risk.
Again, I'm sure this will rumble on. Now, let's turn our attention to Stamford Bridge. Despite a mixed start to the season on the pitch, the chaos off the field seems to be going on at Chelsea, with reports of a rift between the ownership. Todd Boehly has reportedly fallen out with Clearlake Capital, who he co-owns the club with, and is said to have lost faith in their working relationship. Stefan, there's a report in the Times today from Matt Lawton saying the exit of Maurizio Pochettino sparked this rift. Paul Winstanley and Lawrence Stewart apparently produced an 18-page report explaining why Pochettino needed to be replaced. Does it seem to you now that both sides are trying to push each other out in this scenario?
Well, I think realistically, given the way the shareholding works and the scale of the investment that's been made, it's not going to be an easy thing for one party to push the other one out. I think what we're probably seeing now is it becoming public that clearly behind the scenes, the shareholders have not been completely aligned on strategic decisions or day-to-day matters. And I suspect that the Pochettino thing is only the final straw that's triggered us into this next phase, really, and that things have been brewing for quite some time. We've known from the outside that the sort of perception that Boehly was in control has not been correct, and that Clearlake have been much more hands-on over the last 6 to 12 months. After a period where Boehly was the key decision maker. So we know that there have been changes. And of course, most of the rest of the game is looking at the Chelsea situation and slightly perplexed by some of the strategic decisions taken in respect from a footballing perspective. And so it's no great surprise that from the inside as well, some of the shareholders are thinking, I don't agree with X or Y. And I think that's what we're starting to see. And I think so. Really, what we're going to see now is actually how do they unwind their ownership and their investments, and that's not going to be straightforward because the sums involved are very, very substantial.
How could this all play out then? Do you think? Does it become a bit of a battle between these two sides? And if it is, who for you is more likely to come out on top?
Well, Clearlake hold most of the cards. I mean, they are the 61% shareholder, first of all. They also have certain additional rights within their shares. And then on top of that, you've got a situation where Boehly, Weiss and Walter have got 13% each. So in essence, unless they act as a block, they are a relatively small minority. So really, it's a question of whether one of the sides can find enough money to buy the other one out. And it's not an insignificant amount of money when the valuation may be, $3 billion plus. I think it's impossible at this stage to say how it's going to plan out. But in terms of Clearlake, if Clearlake don't want to sell, I think it's going to be very hard for Boehly and the rest of his consortium to remove them. They will have rights to effectively block certain things happening, and they are in the driving seat right now.
Steve, hearing all those details there from Stefan, and also he's picked out the fact that people have been a bit perplexed by the way that Chelsea have done their business since that takeover as well. But in terms of this rift, how much do you think that as this plays out, it could harm Chelsea's development?
Yeah, I think within a football club, you have to be aligned and together, from the manager and the team, from the right back to the centre back, right the way through to the chairman and the board. If you don't have that alignment and that togetherness, then you are going to struggle to deliver ultimately what you want, which is success on the pitch. There has to be a togetherness. There has to be that mentality. And clubs, I was at Millwall for 8 years. We thrived on having that togetherness throughout the club under John Berylson, and having that siege mentality that allows you to deliver. And when that breaks, and I saw it at Southend when I was there for a period of time, when that breaks, it becomes extremely difficult. And what goes on in the boardroom shouldn't affect what happens on the pitch. But it's inevitable that actually that is going to cause problems.
On the last episode of How Football Works, which you can watch on the talkSPORT YouTube channel, we had Jim Rodwell on, the CEO of Charlton, and he said that actually he didn't mind what Chelsea were doing off the pitch. He said, yes, it's unorthodox, but actually, you know, in the long run, this could work for them. Is that how you see it?
Well, it's entertaining, right? Let's put it up. Look, of course, there isn't a rule book that says you have to run a club in a certain way, and people operating in different ways and trying to do things differently and to break the market and be different, it is sometimes good and sometimes that can work. But there's a reason why clubs have been running away for a long time. So I get what Jim Rodwell's saying. I know Jim well. And yes, maybe it works, but only time will tell, right?
Indeed. Stefan, the Chelsea CEO, Chris Jurasek, has left the club after 15 months. And I can see your wry smile because on your Twitter, you threw your hat in the ring to be the next CEO of Chelsea. I mean, how serious were you?
Not serious at all. I think, given my views on how Chelsea have emerged over time, I think it's extremely unlikely that they'll pick up the phone. But look, Chelsea is a great club, right? I mean, the opportunities there are obvious, and it's going to be a job that anybody is going to want in the game, whether it's worked or not right now for Jurasek. You know, it is kind of irrelevant. That there's a massive opportunity for them, but it's an incredibly challenging situation. We know that without the £100 million a year plus from the Champions League, it's a challenge on their current cost base. And unless they can find a way to address that, they are going to have a challenge going forward in respect of PSR, squad cost control, whatever the regime is in place. Unless Chelsea can get their revenues back up to the £500 million level and beyond, then they are going to have some challenges. And that's really got to be the key priority for them, getting back in the Champions League. And they may well have the quality on the pitch to do that this season. We'll see. But you know, I think as Steve says, everybody pulling in different directions off the pitch is not going to help with that stability. But there's clearly an amazing opportunity there. I think everything that Todd Boehly says about why he invested in the first place, the best sport in the best city and the best location within that city, it puts Chelsea in a very favourable position. But they have to deliver and they have to execute. And that's going to be a big challenge for them.
Does it feel at the moment as if Todd Boehly is being squeezed out of Chelsea?
Well, it does. It does look like that from the outside. I mean, you know, if you were to look at the briefing, I mean, that is, I think, what they're indicating in the briefings. But it's not that easy to squeeze somebody out if he carries the support of 38% of the shareholder base, which I think it looks like Todd Boehly does. It looks like Todd Boehly speaks for not just himself, but also for the other two main investors. But unfortunately, that probably means that it's going to be more of a battle than Chelsea would hope. It won't be something where, and also the value of the club, but it won't be something that can be fixed in a very simple way. If that relationship really is broken, the cash required to fix the problem is very, very big. And that's what would concern me. But, you know, these people are all very sophisticated, very successful business people. I'm sure that they can find a way. It's just a case of exactly what that looks like.
Steve, I'm not sure if you've been involved in clubs where this has been a similar kind of situation, and how has it played out sometimes if that has been the case?
Probably need to be slightly careful what I say now. Look, I was at Southend, and Ron Martin, who's left that club now, was a complex individual, ran the club from a high in an unusual way. When I first joined there, Paul Sturrock was the manager, and people weren't getting paid, players weren't getting paid, and we had to create a huge siege mentality amongst the squad. And that togetherness they managed to create, in spite of what happened above them, almost to prove that they were better, actually really worked. So it doesn't always follow that the instability or such challenges cause insurmountable problems. There are solutions, and footballers are very good at finding ways of dealing with complex issues on the field and off the field. So it's not straightforward. And if it was straightforward, football would be boring. So I've seen situations where boards aren't aligned and it becomes very, very challenging. I was at Charlton for a number of years, and as we went down the leagues, that became a difficult problem with the boards actually not aligned. And as a result, the club ended up in League One, having fallen out of the Premier League. So it can go both ways. It's unquestionable that togetherness running through a club from the top of the club down to the bottom is the best way forward. And I don't think anyone would ever dispute that is going to cause you a problem. That's not going to cause you a problem. But the other way is more likely to.
Stefan, I know you were joking about Chelsea, but on a serious note, if, I don't know, Brighton or Bournemouth or a club like that came in and said, Stefan, we want you to be our CEO, would you do it?
I'm available. I'm ready. Premier League, any Premier League opportunity. Yeah.
Fantastic.
You know where to find me.
Yeah.
No, Chelsea as well, but I suspect they don't want me.
And Steve, what about you?
Well, it seems that Stefan and I are only here because we're out of work. So, look, you're in. I've been in the game for 23 years as CEO, and at the beginning of that as a finance director. The game is unique. It's fantastic. It gives you a huge amount. It takes a huge amount. It can leave you with scars. But the overriding feeling is one of absolute joy to have done a job that most people would love to be able to have the privilege of doing. So the opportunity to get back in, you'd love to do it. And I think, clearly that long-term experience and that knowledge of the nuances of the game is really important. And the owners that come in now and they say, "Oh, we can do this ourselves. We know differently. We're gonna change this." Inevitably, they actually find out that it's a bit more complicated than that, and experience counts for a lot.
Well, I'm certain both of you will be snapped up very quickly. I would put myself forward, but that would be an absolute disaster. Now, if you were one of the millions of people who tried to get Oasis tickets recently, only to see some prices double over the course of the day, look away now, because there was outrage this past week over Aston Villa's price hike for Champions League fixtures. If we look at some of these figures, Stefan, £85 to £97 some of these tickets were costing for Villa supporters. Season ticket holders were discounted at between £70 and £82. But if you compare that to Newcastle a couple of seasons ago, and I think that's probably the fairest way to do it, their prices were between £30 and £55 last season for home games. I'm a Newcastle fan. I went to one of these games against Borussia Dortmund. Brilliant experience, but it felt like a fair price at the time. So what do you make of these price hikes for Aston Villa?
Look, I think we've got an issue with ticket prices that are coming across from all live events. So if you look at what's happening in music, I mean, you mentioned Oasis before. If you look at, I think a standing ticket for one of the Oasis gigs is £150. We know that the prices for the Taylor Swift gigs were enormous as well. I know people would fly over from the US to, including the flight, because it was cheaper to watch here. We've got inflation on live performance coming over from the US, and it's something we are going to have to deal with and get used to. It's not really, I know Villa are suggesting that it's a new thing, but the prices that have been charged in the London clubs have been very, very similar to those Aston Villa prices for Champions League. The prices that are being paid around Europe, if you were to have a look at Bayern Munich's Category A tickets, they range broadly from there are some standing seats in the standing tickets in the corners and behind the goal that are cheap, but the majority of those seats are over 100 euros. Some of them are 120 euros. If you were to look at the ticket prices for Milan, for the Liverpool game, they go as far as 350 euros for some of those tickets. Almost all of them are over 100 euros. So it's not a new thing. I mean, I think
I guess some fans will listen to that and say, well, understandably, they are very high prices, but this is Aston Villa's first time back in the Champions League for a very long time, whereas they're quite long-standing clubs, both Milan and Bayern Munich. Would that be fair?
Well, it would, but you know, we know that Villa have invested a huge amount of money to get themselves into this position, and we know that they had severe PSR issues in terms of what happened before 30th of June. So I don't think it's a surprise that they have to look at every line of revenue and seek to maximise it. Now, of course, as fans, we hate it. And, you know, it's not just a Champions League issue. It's not just a London club issue. It's not just a Villa issue. I mean, I paid for my own ticket for City against Arsenal next week. It's an £87 ticket. It's not a hospitality ticket, or there's no additional, drinks or anything with it. That is what a seat costs now to watch Premier events, including Premier League football and Champions League football. Unfortunately, it probably is the reality. I suspect, and again, people are not going to like it, fans are not going to like it, and I don't like it, but I suspect that the Aston Villa owners are thinking that they don't understand the fuss. You know, they're American owners, and they're probably looking at it and thinking, you know, why is there such uproar? This is a massive game for the club, and therefore, of course, it's going to cost a lot of money.
Steve, as a former CEO, do you go along with that actually, because of the status of this game, if you like, that this has been a fair price rise for fans?
Ticket pricing is one of your most complex issues that you have to deal with as a CEO. You have to remember the fan base is there, why they're there. They're back to all those years, and without those people, what are you? But at the same time, you have the dynamic coming the other way, which, you know, the PSR, and exactly as Stefan says, the owners have invested substantial sums of money. Millwall losing £10 million. The only way of getting that back is to put the ticket prices up, but you can't, because you put those prices up, you'd have no fans left. Every year, when you look at ticket pricing, you know, I used to go to boards, and across all three clubs I've worked at, that paper you put to the board and explaining, and they're saying, we'll put the prices up because we've got a massive hole. But actually putting the prices up in an EFL perspective, if you're not sold out, doesn't mean the revenues go up. You're putting the ticket price up, but the revenues actually can go down because of that. In Villa's scenario, they clearly have more demand than they have supply. The owners are putting a lot of money in. From a business perspective, you can understand what they do. I think where it gets to those scenarios, what they need to do is to communicate with the fans clearly. And I haven't looked at what they've done with the fans, so I'm being a bit judgmental here unfairly maybe. But look at how you communicate with the fans. Look at how you're talking to the fans, and explain these issues to the fans, because they're there for everyone to see. And PSR is as we've discussed for a long time today, it's a big topic. And the last thing the fans would want is for Villa to be failing on PSR. And sometimes you have to play your part in this.
Do you think, though, with some clubs that the line is blurred a bit when it comes to making money and when it comes to almost the right moral decision in terms of letting the fans pay a reasonable price?
It's a really difficult balancing act between those two. And I'm fortunate, I suppose, in the clubs I've worked for, that actually having the fans fully on side and that togetherness, which again we spoke about earlier, was absolutely critical. And unfortunately, I wasn't in a scenario where every week we're sold out. So I didn't have the luxury of being able to then start to put prices up in those situations. I can get what Villa have done, but I just, you have to feel for the fans. But how do you balance that off between the two of the club failing financially and the money the owners are putting in versus how far the fans' wallets can afford to go, and at what point does their support break? And they're not customers, they're fans, and that is a really important piece to remember.
Stefan, if we just go back to that Oasis situation, did you get tickets, by the way?
No.
Oh, bad luck. Me neither. But if we go back to that situation, because a lot of the criticism towards that has been this dynamic pricing model where the cost changes depending on the demand. It's had a lot of scrutiny since the tickets for those gigs came out, but it could be on its way into football as well. I believe Valencia have become one of the first clubs to implement this kind of model. Do you think that would be something that clubs will look at and think, right, this is something we need to jump on now, or will they actually take the view? It seems that Steve's got here that actually they need to maintain that fairness towards fans.
Yeah, look, you've always got to balance supply and demand and the fairness to the fans, and also having the system work properly. I think Oasis, the issue on the Oasis tickets was the way that it was done and the expectation that people had. They queued all day, and then all of a sudden it's a 3x ticket price. Nobody is ever going to accept that as a customer. I mean, they may pay the money, but they're never going to be happy with that scenario. We have dynamic pricing in all sorts of industries that we accept. I mean, we accept it on an EasyJet flight or a Ryanair flight, you know, or other ticket prices. We actually accept it in football. If you buy a season ticket, you're effectively involved in dynamic pricing because you're paying a lower amount for that early commitment of the cash and also of the number of games that you're going to take. So in itself, it's not, you know, you can't rule it out, but the system would have to be run properly. And I think really it has to be framed the other way around, in that it would be rewarding those people that commit earlier. So if it's a game outside of the Premier League or at a club that has many, many seats available, if you're going to commit to buy a ticket early on and not wait to see how the team's doing at a particular time in the future, then you should be rewarded with a discount. And so it's kind of dynamic pricing, but in reverse. But look, these things are coming particularly to the Premier League, largely because a demand is outstretching supply. And when that happens, then we know that economics says the prices will go up. And that's where we are. It's really just a case of what format it looks like, as opposed to whether it's going to happen. We are going to have inflation in prices. And it is important to remember that almost all clubs at an operating level are losing money. So this is not a case where clubs are profiteering. They're loss-making. Most of the clubs are loss-making at an operating level before they start selling players and doing things of that nature, selling hotels if you're Chelsea and lucky enough to have a hotel to sell. So, you know, we do have to remember that the clubs are getting a lot of owner funding right now. And so we can expect prices to continue to rise, unfortunately.
Steve, what would your take be on dynamic pricing in football? Do you go along with what Stefan's saying there?
Yeah, it exists in football. To what level it exists? You know, within the EFL, tickets on a match day are more expensive than before. Now, that's communicated to fans and they have that decision to be able to buy earlier. The higher category games, so in the Championship, Leeds will be priced higher than when you're playing a Rotherham, for example. And no disrespect to Rotherham, but the Leeds is a more attractive game. The demand for the tickets is higher, so the tickets are higher. So it does actually already exist there. And but if you're going to go to the extreme of the Ticketmaster and the Oasis, if you're trying to buy an Oasis ticket, and I tried and failed as well, and I think I even failed in the lottery afterwards. If you knew at the beginning that you could have been subject to huge dynamic pricing when you got there, maybe it wouldn't have been so painful. And I suspect that everyone would have still bought their ticket. But it's more the fact that it was a shock when they got there that allowed this to become a story, because it wasn't communicated properly. Football's clear in its dynamic pricing that exists at the moment. Your season ticket normally is cheaper. Your ticket, if you buy it early, normally is cheaper. Your ticket for the higher category game will be more expensive. It exists. When you buy an airline ticket, you go on the website, it's there, it's clear. It doesn't move between clicking I'm going to go on that flight to then going to checkout. And I believe that's the issue here, that actually it was done to an extreme level that created discomfort. So I think it's inevitable in football that it will happen. I think it, as Stefan says, they are loss-making businesses. So I think clubs should use dynamic pricing in an appropriate manner, well communicated. And let's be honest, dynamic pricing means that if there's still tickets left, the price should go down as well. So as long as it's fair, then I think it can be properly communicated and done in a reasonable way that is fair to fans.
Steve, do you think that if we talk about the overall cost of football at the moment, which has inflated over the years, whether that's been ticket prices or maybe the price of a football shirt and other elements such as that, do you think that some clubs need to take a bit of a responsibility in terms of the financial situations of some of their most loyal fans and to make sure that football isn't pricing them out?
Yes. Look, clearly the fans are... in my thinking throughout my time within EFL clubs, the fans are very high in your thinking. But the owners are critical. Going to the owner every month and asking for £1 million or £2 million is not an easy conversation, I assure you. However, unfortunately, you have to do it. And then having had that conversation and saying, oh, by the way, we're going to freeze ticket prices, that's an uncomfortable place to be as a CEO. So you have to have rationales on what you're doing, and it has to be about aligning everyone. It comes back to that point from earlier. If you're aligned from the chairman down, and that includes the fan base and the way you communicate with the fan base, then actually, if you all understand what you're doing, you're all in it together, then you find ways of doing that and sharing the pain amongst you.
Stefan, just finally, what about a ticket price cap? Would that be something that football should look to bring in? I mean, we've seen it with away games for the Premier League, and that seems to have been a very popular and a very good one to have brought in. Is it even a regulator that could come in to sort all this kind of thing out?
Well, look, the away ticket pricing works brilliantly for fans. I mean, there's no question. It makes, particularly when you go to some of those London games, even more enjoyable. Paying £30 at Chelsea when you're literally sat two seats down from a home fan that's probably paying 3x, maybe even more. You know, it is great, but I suspect it's not sustainable for most clubs to accept a cap on tickets. It would remove a big chunk of revenue for some of the clubs, particularly the London-based clubs. I think would fight very hard to prevent that. So I think we should take what we've got in terms of the away fan ticket caps. I think they work well. And I would allow supply and demand to dictate what's paid for home fans. And also, just, you know, I think, as Steve says, there has to be some trust that the boards as custodians of these clubs are mindful of the importance of the fan. It's just not the case that people are going round trying to profiteer from their fans. All the clubs understand the importance of the fan. And where they can, I think, you know, they will offer, you know, good value ticketing. And I don't think it's something that government or regulation should interfere with. And I think if it did, we would have quite a significant issue just from the viability of another thing in terms of the viability of clubs.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure. Sorry that you both missed out on those Oasis tickets, but yeah, maybe next time. That brings us to the end of today's episode. Remember, you can get in touch and post your comments below, and our expert panel will answer them as best as they can. Thank you very much for your company, and see you next time.